Ask yourself, what is it that matters to you that would have you here today? What matters most? And see if you can listen through that place, listen through your heart and through that care. What it is that you care about most that would have you spending this time with me. And when you're ready, take a deep breath. And on your exhale, you can flutter your eyes open. Maybe start with looking down at the table. And then gazing around at the room, remembering that we're connected not only with ourselves and the earth and with spirit, but with each other. So what I care about that has me offering this talk to you today is a situation in our world that has me really feeling disturbed. Really disturbed. David joked around when we met in the hall and he said, "Oh, I'm so excited to hear your talk about love and light and joy." And I said, "I think you came to the wrong talk." Yeah, so this is kind of a thing that's been burning in me for a while, ever since the election. But I want to go back before that and tell you a little story first that happened a long time ago. When I was 17, I met my first husband. I was super young, but the first thing that he did on our first date was lie to me. He lied to me about who he was, what he did for a living. He didn't lie about where he lived, but those are some pretty big things. And I gave it a pass. I gave it a pass, and I ended up marrying him years later. And all through the marriage, I had thoughts every so often about like, this is not good. He became abusive, and he cheated with money, and he did all these things that I just were not okay with me. He was harsh with my kids, really physically hard on them, and critical, and all these things I couldn't live with. But I doubted myself. Every time that came up, the next thing that came up was like, well, who are you to know? How do you know when it's time to leave a marriage? How do you know what's too much? How could you possibly know if this isn't right? I mean, it obviously was right at the time, you're supposed to stick it out, that sort of thing. So I questioned myself and doubted myself, second-guessed myself a lot. And now, dear you, I'm sorry to tell you this, but I told you so. With love, your intuition. I eventually woke up out of that trance that I was in and got out of that marriage. But it took me a long time to really get clear about what was right for me. And that was the time, I was in my mid-30s, I think. That was the time when I started to wonder what in the world had happened to my intuition. Where had it gone? How come it wasn't guiding me in a good way anymore? Why I had just lost touch and access. And so I started on a path to reclaim and relearn what it is to use intuition, because it had really, not listening to it had led me down this path toward an abusive marriage that was really awful for my children, and I was not about to repeat that. And here we are, we find ourselves in this world that they're calling the post-truth world. And I think this is why it's so upsetting for me. And I've got this like charge in my system around this, for so many people now, it seems like beliefs have more weight than facts. And there's fake news, and the president is lying 70% of the time, according to Politico, or more. Only 4%, they say, only 4% of what he says is true. So, and for those of you guys, I know there are a few of you here in the room who know the integral model, and if you don't worry about it. I'm not going to keep talking about it, but I'll just make one little note here. We are really sort of getting ourselves more and more deeply into the postmodern era and the pluralistic worldview. And the shadow of that pluralism is this thing that they call aperspectival madness. Aperspectival madness means, so everyone has a truth, and all truths are equally valid. But then if all truths are equally valid, then there's no ground to stand on. There's no ground to stand on. So I think that this post-truth world that we're in is actually a mirror reflection of the consciousness that we're in right now. It's the shadow reflection of that pluralistic, postmodern orientation. So that's all I'm going to say about that for now, because it's not an integral talk, but that's how I see it. So essentially what's going on here is called gaslighting. Have any of you ever heard of that? Gaslighting? So maybe half the room. Gaslighting it's a term that comes from a 1938 movie by that name, Gaslight. And essentially it refers to a situation in which somebody is lying or manipulating the truth in such a way that actually you start to question your own sense of reality and what's real. It's like, there's a pejorative word for it. Mind. Yeah. So for me, this all actually started even before my marriage, even before I was 17 and I met my ex-husband. So I started to look, more recently into like, well, why would I have bypassed my intuition? I knew he was lying. I mean, I knew by, day 2 or 3 that he was lying. Why would I have bypassed what I knew? Why would I have stepped right over my intuition? And I realized it's because I was used to it. I was used to it. My parents had gaslighted me from the time I was a really little girl. Not in a bad way, not because they were bad people or they were trying to get away with something like my husband. They were actually trying to be helpful, but they lied to me about the state of their marriage, which was not good. They were quite disconnected, and they didn't tell me. And they made it look like everything was fine. And they also lied to me about my mother's mental health. My mother was seriously depressed for my whole life, and no one told me until I was 16, and she attempted suicide. And that was the first time I even heard anything about her depression, but it had been going on ever since I was a tiny girl. So I realized, I was susceptible to gaslighting with my ex-husband because it was just kind of like normalcy for me. And I had learned from that experience with my parents, this is what children do, right? Children, like I was in this position of, I'm actually quite perceptive, and I'm empathic and psychic. So I was perceiving that things were not okay in Disneyland. But my parents kept telling me that things were fine. And so I got into this dilemma of having to choose what is true, my reality or their reality. And for kids, it's not a question. Like, kids are always going to choose the parents because it's a matter of survival, right? So I chose, well, I guess I have to believe the authority figures, and my perception doesn't count. My perception isn't even trustable. So that's where all that came from for me. But I'm here to tell you, not just for me, I cannot afford to do that anymore. We cannot afford to do that anymore. We cannot afford to override our inner knowing and our intuition. Can any of you relate to that? Has anybody in this table been on override with intuition? Not trusting yourself? That's what I want to talk about today. We can't afford to do that anymore because of what's going on in the world. Because we don't even know what's true. Even in the newspapers, like I'm a big fan of the New York Times. I've always thought, and I was a journalism major when I was in college here at CU. So I'm a big fan of like objective truth and facts and, high quality journalism. But even these days, I even read the New York Times with a suspicion about bias. It's just nothing seems like it's like super solid anymore. Does anybody relate to that? Yeah. So we cannot afford to be questioning our reality so much. Does anybody know what this card is?
Tarot card, right?
Tarot card, yeah, the Hierophant. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Hierophant, something like that. This is the symbol of the patriarchy. And what I'm seeing these days is, a lot of people are talking about that we're coming to an end of the era of patriarchy. But I think that it seems to me like it's actually in its like death throes. It's like clenching and thrashing and getting darker and more dangerous than it really ever has been. And hopefully that means good things are coming. That they say that the darkest hour comes right before dawn. But we cannot afford to give a pass to liars anymore. We cannot afford to overlook what we know is a deeper truth anymore, especially not if it's going to get darker. So, talking a lot about why I think this gaslighting is such a terrible thing. And I imagine you're all in agreement about that. Is that true? Yeah, and most people do see it as a terrible thing. But what occurs to me and what I want to talk to you about here is that I also see it as a gift. Gaslighting as a gift. I see everything that's dark in our world as a gift, actually. One thing I haven't shared with you yet is that I've been a student of shadow work for 20 years, and I apprenticed for 5 years with a shaman who specializes in shadow work. So and I can't seem to escape it. It's my path. Never really wanted to be. Whoever wants to be a shadow worker? It's not an ambition. It's actually more of a calling that I have tried to avoid and can't avoid. So I'm gonna actually talk about shadow work. In my training, in the shamanic view, there's always a gift in the shadow. There is always that, and that's actually the purpose of it. Okay? So what could that be? What could that be? I love this picture because you can see the shadow, but the thing that's creating the shadow is in the light and it's beautiful, right? It's in the light and it's beautiful. So there's something here that is not dark, that is beautiful and full of light, and it's the shadow of which is pointing us to it. The shadow actually points to the thing. My teacher would say, the shadow actually points to the energy or the capacity that we need most and need next in our evolution. so that we can fulfill our purpose. So lots of people think that working with shadow is like this George Michael song. You know this George Michael song, Freedom? All we have to do now is take these lies and make them true somehow. Yeah, so I agree with that. Yes, that's where we're going. All we have to do is take these lies and make them true. But my way of doing that is a little more complicated, I think, than a little more complex in the way that most people think about it. Most people will think that with shadow, we have to take what we don't want, lies, and turn it into or seek out its opposite, truth. So we don't want the lies, so now we have to seek truth, right? That's shadow work. That's not really it. That's a little too simple. But there is some truth to that. It's just not in the way that you might think. So along those lines of how do we take lies and make them into truth, So I think what I hear most people advocating for these days is more reason, more logic, more science, more data, more evidence, right? Because that's what's failed, people are just ignoring science and reason and data. And so we need to go back to that. We need to double down on critical thinking skills and teaching kids logic and, scientific method, all those things. Anybody here agree with that? I do. I do too. I agree with that. I just don't think it's enough. I don't think it's enough. What I think is humans are evolving, right? We're constantly evolving. If you know integral theory, you know about spiral dynamics and how humans don't just evolve at the individual level and get more mature, but we also evolve as a collective, as a society. And we go through these stages. So we went through this stage they call the Age of Enlightenment, where reason and science came on board. And it was such a huge improvement over what we had before. Superstition and kind of magical thinking that didn't really make any sense, and the earth was flat. So the Age of Enlightenment was a huge step forward for humanity. And then what happens in evolution is we come to a point where the very thing that was the step forward starts to hold us back. It starts to hold us back. And then life circumstances will come in and create a situation where we actually have to evolve past that point. And we ought to go to the next stage, the next level. That's where I think we are now. I think we have come to the point where the Age of Enlightenment has reached the limits of its effectiveness and actually has started to hit the shadow realms. We have outsourced truth to external sources, experts and scientists and journalists. We've outsourced it so much that we don't actually have access as much as we should to our internal truth. And we've allowed that part of ourselves to atrophy. It's like a muscle that gets weak from misuse or disuse, lack of use. All right, so we're going to really go a little deeper into this shadow. I'll show you how I would work with it, not the simplistic way, but in a more sort of complex shamanic way. So Carl Jung said, "No tree can grow to heaven unless the roots reach down to hell." So we have to reach down into this shadow. We can't ignore it. We can't dismiss it. We can't skip over it. And we actually have to turn toward it and reach down into it to get the gift that is needed for our evolution, the thing that we need next. Yeah. So what is it that needs to be integrated? Remember my teacher said, the shadow points the way toward the energy or the capacity that we need in order to take our next step and to grow to the next level. So what is that? Well, if we have something like alternative facts, if I were to flip that and, using my shamanic training, if I were to flip that and say, well, what's the energy or capacity? What's that daisy in the light that this shadow is pointing to? The daisy in the light that this shadow is pointing to is a kind of alternative reality. In shamanism, we call it non-ordinary reality. And it is, sometimes also shamans will call it the dream time. The dream time. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Non-ordinary. Has anybody ever done like mind-altering substances? Some of those psychedelics will also open up the part of our brain that can give us access to this dream time, to this non-ordinary reality. It includes all kinds of things like the subconscious, the collective unconscious that Jung talked about, dreams and images that come in visually, intuition, non-physical. It's the realm of the non-physical, the things that you can't necessarily, touch with your hand or measure with a measuring tape or an electroscope, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So non-ordinary reality. So the shadow of alternative facts could be pointing us to, hey, we need to get more in touch with this non-ordinary reality. Yep. And then this shadow of we can no longer trust external sources. That, I think, is pointing us to come back home so we can trust our internal authority that we've really kind of lost touch with. Is this making sense? Any questions so far? I'm just going to answer Patty's question, and then I'll keep going, and hopefully he'll be back. It's a great question, and I could give a whole talk about that. So I can't answer it in depth. Right. But there is this understanding that thousands of years ago, as a society, we were sort of enraptured with magical thinking. And even as kids individually, we all go through that stage. And then we learn reason, And so reason comes in after. So there's magical thinking, and then there's reason. And then what I'm suggesting is, and developmental theory would also suggest, is there's another stage that comes after that is like post-reason. Transrational is a word that I've heard. Transrational. So it doesn't throw out reason. And it also does not, it transcends and includes reason and magical thinking in a way that's actually where we're headed in this talk. So it is tricky because the people who are doing the gaslighting are using magical thinking that's actually not intuitive. It is not the kind of non-ordinary reality I'm talking about. They are really actually in magical thinking. Mm-hmm. There were, millions of people at Trump's parade is just not true. But in any stretch of anybody's imagination, not true. So that's not what I'm talking about. Non-ordinary reality is more like having access to the non-physical realm. The non-physical realm, where there are ideas, images, insights, and even beings that exist in this realm that we cannot see, in the unseen. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. I'm just going to repeat just for the video, but Tom said, reason begins to see its own limits. And this is exactly what I was just talking about when I said I think we've reached the point in the Age of Enlightenment where we've hit the limit of that, the limit of its effectiveness, and we need to go further. So, just a quick moment to even just talk about what do I mean by intuition. I looked it up in Webster's, and I did not like the definition. So I didn't include it because the Webster's definition essentially says, it says it's the opposite of rational. And I don't, first of all, you're not supposed to define things in terms of their opposite, right? But I don't even agree that it's the opposite of reason. So I didn't put that definition here. Here's one from Jung: perception via the unconscious that brings forth new possibilities and ways out of blocked situations. Perception, I love that, because that's what I was caught up with when I was a little girl. It's like, can't trust my perception. Perception is actually a big category, you know. So here's mine: insight gained through non-physical, non-empirical cues and clues. Cues and clues. That comes from my Apache teacher. Cues and clues. And then knowledge that comes from the unseen realms. This is what I was just sharing with Patty. Yeah. Some people would even say, and I would agree, that intuition is the voice of the soul. And so the closer we get to being in relationship with our soul, the closer we are to having access to this intuitive realm. Another quote from Jung, and I love this because he's talking about how it's not the opposite of reason. Intuition is not the opposite of reason. It's something outside the province of reason. You just can't get there from here, you know? You can't get there from here. They're not directly opposed to each other. They're just two different things. Yeah. And Einstein said, I'm sure you've seen this one, the intuitive mind is a sacred gift. I so agree with that, because it actually is the part of us that is intuitive, is the part of us that is connected to spirit, connected to all that is. The part of us that is divine, you know, the little drop of divine water in the ocean. That's the part of us that is intuitive. So that is the sacred gift. And the rational mind is a faithful servant. Its right place is as a faithful servant to intuition. And we have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. And my body is just going like chills, ding, 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 ding. Yes, Almina?
Can I pitch in another definition that I cannot just feel right now?
Yes.
So for me, intuition is what is left when I'm removing that which I thought was true, but it really isn't. And just like the really like honest place where with yourself.
Yeah. The really honest, I'm just going to repeat you for the video, the really honest place in yourself, and you point it to your heart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like when you remove kind of the stories
Yes.
about what is true and really just be with what really is true.
Yes. Thank you. Right, so, you know, I'm a leadership coach. So when I look out into the future, I see the need for this sort of what I'm calling an integrated intelligence, reason and intuition together. That's how I operate in my business, and it's how some of my friends operate in our businesses. But I don't see it a whole lot in mainstream, and I'd like to see it a whole lot more. So this idea from integral theory and from Ken Wilber is called transcend and include, or I like to say include and transcend. So we include reason and transcend it and add intuition, and then we have something much better. And when I look out into the future, I see a world in which the best leaders, the ones who get the best results, are going to be doing both. They're going to be measuring data, and they're going to be gathering information from intuition, the unseen world. They're going to read spreadsheets, and they're going to read energy signatures. They're going to consult the board of directors, and they're going to consult their inner wisdom council of light beings who are guiding them. They're going to hire people who are good at strategy, and they're going to hire magi. You like it? I actually have a friend who is she's a good seer. She's a psychic, and two good friends who are both psychics. And they are working in a startup that's in astrophysics, I guess, right? Like they're selling this incredible technology to the US, to NASA. And they were invited into this business because they have this whole range of skills. They have the whole range. One of them is a scientist and astrophysicist herself, and she worked for Ball forever. And the other one is a strategist, a business strategist, but they're both psychic. And so they were hired into this startup because they have both, and they're asked every day to use both of those skills. And they use their psychic seeing and their magic and all of their business skills together. Is that cool or what? So how? Oh my God, here we are. So hopefully I've convinced you that this integration is important and it's coming and we all need to get on board, right? How are we supposed to do that? So there are some things in the way, and because as a shadow worker, I have to address that first, right? Like what's in the way? What can we clear out of the way so that we can develop this skill? So for myself, stepping through the portal into using more and more of my intuition, I told you the story at the beginning about how it got me into huge trouble when I didn't listen. And now I'm going to tell you a story about what happened when I did. So there's a spiritual teacher in our integral community who is so gifted and so brilliant, and just when he taps into the divine, he can fill 500 people in a room with divine love in their hearts. I mean, he is so powerful that way. And I went to an integral conference where he was teaching several years back, and I walked into that room with 500 people, and I walked right back out because he was on the stage, and my body said no. My body said no. And I have never had an experience that was that loud in my life. And I was like, by that point, I had developed enough to learn to trust it. And so even though all of my friends were saying, you have to meet this man, I said no, and I walked out. And then the next year, he was also teaching, and I was presenting at the Integral Theory Conference. And I was walking through the bar, and my friend waved me over, come, you have to meet him, you have to meet him. And I just kept walking right by. No. And then the next year, he came to Boulder, and he was actually leading the entire conference, not just teaching, and I didn't even go. All my friends went. It was the talk of the town, and I didn't go. I was just really clear. And the next year, it came out that he had been abusing women for 25 years. Not just abusing them, gaslighting them. Does it feel that in your body? I can feel it in mine too. It feels gross. Yeah? So who in here can feel that? Okay. So this is what I'm talking about, trusting the intuition. I learned from getting burned with my ex-husband, and I don't do that anymore. I also have another story about my son. I want to say, that was a story about how intuition can bless you and guide you and keep you safe. It also is not easy. It's not easy to follow. I had a situation with my son. It's kind of a long story, and I don't think I have time to tell the whole thing, but he was really in trouble, deeply in trouble with drugs when he was 17. He said he wanted to come. This is actually how I ended up in Boulder. He wanted to come to Boulder and change his life. We used to spend our summers here. Wanted to come to Boulder and change his life. And so I spent the summer helping him to get clean and healthy. All my friends from the Integral Center, the men in my life from the Integral Center, swooped him up and took him rock climbing, and they circled him, and they took him, to the gym. They just spent all this time with him to really help him. It was amazing. And then at the end of the summer, he said he wanted to go home to Ohio because his girlfriend was going to take him back. And everything in me just said, no! And Mama Bear, Mama Bear was like, hell no, I'm not letting him go back. The drug counselor said 90% chance he would go back into it. But my intuition said, you have to let him choose and trust him with his choice. So there's a lot more to that story. I took him to counsel with the shamans from all over the world, and I sent him into the sweat lodge and all these things so that he could get in touch with his inner knowing about it. And then I told him I would trust him with his choice. And when he came out of the sweat lodge on the last day, we'd spent a whole week in council with the shamans. He came out of the sweat lodge on the last day and said, I'm going back. I can feel that now. I was just so crushed and so worried. And my intuition said, trust him. His soul knows what he's doing. So I sent him home to Ohio, and he made it. He made it against all odds. He never went back. Never went back. Still to this day, he's 22 years old, and he still does not even drink. So it's not easy. I'm not telling you it's always easy to listen to it. But when you start practicing and committing, by that point, I had made a commitment to myself that I would listen to my intuition. It does pan out. So what are the things in the way? We're talking about how do we get these things in the way sort of cleared. I see three things happening here. One is dismissal. This one happens super fast, like in a flash. Something comes in and you go, no, that doesn't matter. Or that's not real. Or I didn't hear that. That doesn't mean anything. Anybody can relate to this one? Yeah. This is important to know because intuition is fast. It comes like that. Okay, it comes like that. And if you miss it, you miss it. Or if you dismiss it, it's gone. Doubt. Doubt takes a little longer. It kind of erodes your knowing over time. This is something that happens to me a lot. I had a vision a few years ago, 3 years ago. I saw this darkness coming. It's really intense darkness for us, for the planet. And I was told by my guides only to share it with those who had ears to hear. And I kind of got freaked out. I got freaked out and I didn't know what to do with it. So all this doubt started coming in like, did I really see that? Did I really get that message? Who am I to have that message? Who am I to know this? So I didn't do anything with it. I told my husband, my teacher, and a few people, but I didn't really do anything with it. And then November came around, and I actually had this experience of kind of lying to myself. I was like, wait a minute, how did I didn't see this coming. How could I have not seen this coming? I did see this coming. I did. But I doubted what I had seen. So this is a doozy. This one is a doozy, self-doubt. Override, this is the one that we talked about earlier. Override is when you actually know something, and then you ignore it. Don't act on it. Don't listen or take action. All of these ways of not trusting ourselves, I don't have time to go into all of it now, but basically it comes from our own wounding. I shared some of that with you from my story, but we all have different stories about how we have learned to not trust ourselves. And so what it requires doing a little bit of a deep dive and clearing that stuff, that psycho-spiritual material, clearing some of that stuff so then, we can get actually reconnected with our intuition. Here's some other reasons why we don't trust it. We talked earlier about the rational scientific materialism, sort of the end of the effectiveness of the age of reason. Unconscious wounds from the collective psyche. So things like the Inquisition. I actually had to clear some stuff in my psyche related to the Inquisition. That was really in the way. I also had to clear some things from past lives, which people don't necessarily always subscribe to, but I can tell you from my own experience, I had some past life stuff to clear. That was where I was the one who knew. And that's why I got so freaked out about seeing this darkness coming, because that's happened to me before. I was the one who knew, and when I shared it, bad shit went down. So I had to clear all of that. So there's, all kinds of reasons why we don't trust what comes in intuitively. And how are we going to start to cultivate our connection with inner knowing? So I would suggest that first we start with a mindset of curiosity. I wonder what's possible. I wonder how this might work for me. I'm so curious to see what will happen if I start listening and trusting like that. And then one trick that I have used is looking backwards. So I actually have quite a rational mind, and I like evidence. So I kind of turned it on myself and used a bit of a scientific method to investigate my intuition. So I look backwards at things, and somebody will say something, and I'll be like, "Oh, I knew that." I hadn't brought it all the way out from the back of my mind and the back of my intuition all the way out into speaking it, which is something I often do. I forget to speak the thing. But when I look back in hindsight, I can see all these examples of when I actually knew. I actually knew what was so. And I invite you to do that as well, because it will help to strengthen the muscle. It'll help to strengthen your confidence. External signs. Here's a cute little story that I use. My cat died recently from cancer, and we were waiting for when was the right day to put him down. And I was traveling a lot, and I was worried to leave him, and but I also didn't want to so I didn't want to be gone and let him die while I was gone. And I also didn't want to pick a day for his death that was convenient for me, but it wasn't right for him, So I was unsure of myself, and I was really pretty invested with this whole thing. And so I didn't really trust myself to decide. And I'll talk more about that in a minute, when is your accuracy higher or lower? So I asked for an external sign, and I actually went to visit David. He's my doctor. I went to visit David in Longmont at the office that morning. We thought it was the right day, but in my prayers that morning, I was unsure, so I prayed for a sign. I asked for guidance in the form of an external sign. Is this the right day? I went to see David, and then I went to get coffee. And at the coffee shop, because I never go to this coffee shop, it's in Longmont, right? So I went to this coffee shop, and I walked in, and they had on special that day, they had a Snickers latte. Have you ever heard of? I've never heard of a Snickers latte before, but my cat's name was Snickers. So external signs, that can be helpful as you're learning to build this muscle. We talked about doing the inner work, tuning into the body. There's so many things. I'm going to actually develop a whole course on this, because each one of these things could be a whole class. Tuning into the body, spending quiet time alone. We don't do that enough when we get so addicted to our electronics, that we don't, there's no room for intuitive messages to come through. Because what it requires is being quiet and still. So those are some things you can do. And I just want to end here with a word about, let's do this. I'm going to go to accuracy first, and then we'll end with the heart intelligence. I'm actually studying this. My Apache teacher that I work with a lot is a real expert in in all of this kind of thing. And she also uses kind of a scientific approach. So she has measured like how accurate people are. She can measure, she's going to give me a test when I'm ready about how accurate I am and that kind of thing. So you can actually do that. No one is 100% accurate with intuition. Just like it's also true with science. You know, we have these theories and we prove them and then they get disproved later. So it's just important to know nobody's 100% accurate. The best of us are in the high 80s with accuracy. The ones who are at 90% are usually like can't be in the world. They have to be in an ashram somewhere or a monastery or something. It's just too much for them to be in the world because they're getting too many cues and clues, so much incoming. The ego diminishes accuracy. So the more invested you are in the outcome, the more connected you are with it, the harder it is to be accurate on yourself. It's easier to be accurate when you're intuiting about someone else. So if that happens, you know, what I do is I check with others. And my teacher even does this. You know, she's been teaching this stuff for 50 years. And she's still, when it's about her and her ego is charged up in some way or it's an emotional issue, she will check with others. So asking other intuitives to take a look for you. So, you know, those are some thoughts about accuracy. And I just want to end here with a word about the heart intelligence. And Almina has been demonstrating for us this whole time. The source, we often use the word mind when we talk about the intuitive mind. It's not actually our mind that's at play here, it's our heart. The heart is the source of the inner knowing, and it is our connection to the divine and to divine guidance and the wisdom of our soul. So I want to invite us all now, as we're closing, to take a moment to connect with the heart. And I just want you to feel the heart beating and see it in your inner mind. Visualize, see your heart beating. And see the energy exchange. See the energy coming into your heart. Love energy coming into your heart from the divine. And see it going out of your heart to the world. It's a big flow. Feel your heart expanding to hold all of this love and wisdom and compassion for the world. Your heart is so big. It's not limited. There are no limits on how much your heart can know and how much your heart can love. So as you're being here with your heart, I want you just to call into your attention a question that you have for your life. And hold that question in your heart. You could even imagine seeing it like scribed, you know, like on the wall of your heart in gold pen or some kind of beautiful paint. Scribe the question on your heart. And ask your soul to come in and give you some kind of something, an image or a dream or a word or some kind of felt sense like an energy. Something that will help you. It may not fully answer this question, but it may be the next thing you need to know in order to live with this question. What is the thing that you most need to know to live with this question now. And I'm going to bring us back, so I'm just giving you a moment to get back in touch with your breath and your feet on the floor. Listen to the sounds in the room. And then when you're ready, you can open your eyes and come back. Thank you so much.